A medieval cathedral rose not from a shared blueprint, but from a guarded whisper. For centuries, the most powerful engineering knowledge on Earth was not found in public libraries, but locked inside secretive artisan guilds. This video will reveal exactly how these closed societies monopolized the techniques that built an age, controlling innovation through a web of silence, law, and ritual. You will learn how their strategies for hoarding knowledge shaped our modern world, for better and for worse. We will uncover how a master's handshake could be worth more than gold, and why some brilliant ideas were deliberately buried to protect a guild's power. What does it truly cost a society when progress becomes a secret? That traveling mason carried a world on his shoulders. With the vast administrative machine of Rome gone, the networks that once moved engineers and architectural plans across continents had vanished into memory. What remained were isolated communities, local rulers, and a deep, pressing need to rebuild not just walls, but a sense of permanence. In this fragmented landscape, a single individual's skill became a form of power. If you knew how to fit stones so they locked without mortar, or how to shape a timber roof to withstand decades of snow, you weren't just a worker, you were a lifeline for an entire village's future. It was from this raw, practical necessity that the first guilds began to form, not as shadowy associations of survival. A group of carpenters in one town might band together to guarantee their work met a certain standard, so that a lord hiring them knew he wouldn't get a shoddy fortress gate. A circle of metalworkers might pool resources to buy a better quality of iron, which was scarce and expensive. At their origin, these were brotherhoods of mutual aid. They functioned as insurance for members who fell ill, as a support for a craftsman's family if he passed away, and as a way to train the next generation through a system of apprenticeships. This training was the heart of it. Knowledge wasn't written in books that could be stolen. It lived in the hands, in the subtle feel of a tool, in the eye that could judge the slope of a foundation. To protect that living knowledge was to protect the community's ability to build and thrive. But here lies the fascinating pivot, the moment the seed of exclusivity was planted. As a guild's reputation for quality grew, so did its value. The title of master became a badge that commanded higher pay and greater respect. It was only natural that these masters, who had spent a lifetime perfecting their craft, began to be more selective about whom they taught. Why give away the secret of your unique mortar mixture or your method for tempering sword blades to just anyone? That secret was your family's livelihood. It was the legacy you would pass to your own son or your most trusted apprentice. So the protective circle, born from necessity, began to slowly close. The focus shifted subtly from sharing knowledge to ensure community survival, to controlling knowledge to ensure personal and familial prestige. This was the quiet dawn of the system that would one day command kingdoms. It started not with a desire for domination, but with a simple human instinct to safeguard what is rare and precious. The Guildhall stood as a fortress of knowledge, its gates guarded not by soldiers but by parchment and tradition. To enter this inner circle, you did not knock, you were bound. The guild's first and most formidable monopoly was an absolute control over the very pipeline of skill, a meticulous regulation of who could learn and who could ultimately teach. For a young person with clever hands and ambition, the only door in was through a legal contract called an indenture. This was not a simple agreement. It was a binding document that surrendered a child, often as young as 12 or 13, to a master craftsman for a term of 7 years or more. In exchange for food, shelter, and instruction, the apprentice pledged their labor and obedience. They lived in the master's household, becoming part of his economic unit. The master had a duty to provide training in the fundamentals of the craft, but the contract said nothing about sharing the deeper secrets, the proprietary techniques that made his work exceptional. An apprentice might spend years planing wood or mixing base mortars before ever touching the finer aspects of the joinery or the alchemy of the perfect plaster finish. This lengthy, costly journey created a powerful filter. Only those with families who could afford to forego a child's earnings for a decade could even attempt it, and the master held the keys to progression at every stage. The culmination of this long road was the masterpiece. To earn the title of master and the right to open his own shop, the journeyman, as he was then called, had to produce a final work of exceptional quality. This piece was judged not by the public but by the existing masters of the guild. Think of the immense pressure. Your entire future, your ability to earn a living and support a family, rested on the approval of the very men who would then become your competitors. It was a system designed for cautious continuity, not for disruptive genius. A truly revolutionary design or method might be seen as a threat to established practices and, by extension, to the authority of the judging masters. This bottleneck ensured the number of new masters remained low, and the flow of new ideas into the wider world was slowed to a careful, controlled trickle, all dictated from within the guild's fortified walls. But the guild's monopoly was not enforced by law alone. It was woven into the very air of the workshop, a silent language of gestures and signs that turned public spaces into private domains. On a bustling cathedral site, amid the shouts of laborers and the clang of chisels, a master mason might catch a journeyman's eye and, with a few deliberate movements of his fingers, convey a complex adjustment to an arched curvature. These hand signals were a living cipher, allowing detailed instructions to pass over the noise without a single word that could be overheard by an uninitiated worker or a visiting lord. This was communication refined into an art of secrecy. Beyond gestures, the stones themselves often bore the quiet signature of this closed world. Look closely at the hidden surfaces of medieval buildings, in corners unseen by the public eye, and you might find carefully carved symbols. A simple compass, a particular knot, a unique set of interlocking circles. To the outsider, they appeared as decorative flourishes or the marks of an individual craftsman. To the guild brother, they were identifiers, markers of quality, or even coded references to specific techniques or proportional systems the guild considered its own. Architectural historians note that many of these so-called mystical secrets were, in practical terms, often elegant applications of geometry. The precise method for laying out a complex floor plan using just a rope and stakes, or the template for cutting a perfect stone vault rib, were powerful tools. But by shrouding these methods in ritual and presenting them as profound mysteries revealed only after years of loyalty, the guilds performed a brilliant piece of psychological alchemy. They transformed a practical skill into a sacred trust. The value of the knowledge skyrocketed not because it was magic, but because access to it was made to feel magical. This atmosphere of mystery served a starkly practical purpose. It was a formidable defense against industrial espionage. In an age without patents, a rival could not steal what he could not see or understand. If the core of your technique was communicated through a handshake known only to masters, or recorded in a manuscript filled with allegorical drawings and intentional omissions, it was locked away as securely as gold in a castle vault. This silent language built an invisible wall far stronger than any guild charter. It created a world within a world where a shared glance or a hidden mark affirmed belonging. For the initiate, it fostered profound loyalty and a sense of participating in something greater than a mere trade. For everyone else, it was a constant, quiet reminder that the most important knowledge in the room was passing them by, spoken in a tongue they would never be allowed to learn. A town's survival could depend on a single, crumbling bridge. When the timbers finally gave way after a spring flood, cutting off trade and isolating the community, the local council faced a crisis. They had carpenters, yes, but none who knew the precise geometry for a span that could withstand the river's current. Their desperate search for expertise led them not to a neighboring village, but to a sealed letter sent to the headquarters of a mason's guild in a city over 100 miles away. This was the second formidable layer of the monopoly, control over geography itself. Guilds did not just command who could learn, they dictated where major work could even be attempted. Through royal charters granted by kings who wanted reliable builders for their castles, and through exclusive civic contracts with wealthy towns, guilds carved entire regions into their exclusive domains. To operate outside a guild-sanctioned territory was to be branded an interloper, or worse, a cowan, a contemptuous term for an uninitiated, unlicensed worker. The opposition to such outsiders was not merely professional rivalry. It could be brutally direct, with guildsmen legally empowered to confiscate the tools of an independent craftsman or physically drive him from a worksite. This territorial stranglehold created vast knowledge deserts. Imagine an entire county where no one, no matter how brilliant, could legally learn to construct a complex flying buttress or operate the sophisticated treadmill cranes needed to lift cathedral stones. Those techniques were not secrets in a book. They were living practices, and they resided only in the minds and hands of guild brothers who were concentrated in specific, guild-controlled cities like Chartres, Strasbourg, or Milan. Consequently, architectural innovation did not flow like water across the landscape. It moved at the pace of a guild's own cautious expansion, following the slow migration of a licensed chapter to a new city under a new contract. A revolutionary method for distributing weight in a dome might take generations to travel 200 miles because it had to wait for the guild that owned the knowledge to decide to build there. This system kept entire regions in a state of engineered dependency, their skyline and their safety held hostage by the geographic reach of a privileged few. The most valuable object in a master's workshop was not his finest chisel but a locked chest. Inside, resting on velvet or wrapped in linen, lay the guild's true treasure, its book of secrets. In an age before the printing press, knowledge had physical weight and immense fragility. These manuscripts were not for reading, they were for guarding. Imagine a single hand-drawn parchment showing the precise geometry for laying out a complex spiral staircase, or a page filled with cryptic notes on the exact mixture of lime, sand, and crushed terracotta that produced a mortar harder than the stone it bound. This was not a book in any public sense. It was a corporate asset as vital to the guild's survival as its treasury of gold. The creation of such a manuscript was itself a secretive act. A senior master, over months or years, would translate the knowledge in his hands onto vellum. He used a personal shorthand of symbols, deliberate omissions in diagrams, and allegorical illustrations that only another initiated master could correctly interpret. A drawing of a tower might be labeled with the phases of the moon, a code for specific proportional measurements. A recipe for stained glass might refer to ingredients by mythological names known only within the Brotherhood. This was encryption in its most elegant, analog form. The penalty for copying these pages, or worse, stealing the chest, was severe. Expulsion from the guild meant social and professional death, a loss of the right to practice your lifelong craft. Fines could cripple a family's wealth. Historical records from some city archives note that in extreme cases, such an act could be treated as a crime against the entire town's economic security, leading to banishment. This physical hoarding of information created a profound bottleneck for progress, an ingenious design for a more efficient watermill gear or a safer method for constructing scaffolding lived and died within that single chest. Its dissemination relied entirely on the guild master's collective willingness to innovate and share, which was often minimal. Why risk the guild's unique selling point, its competitive edge, for the abstract benefit of wider knowledge? The status quo was safe and it was profitable. Consequently, engineering advancement became chained quite literally to a locked box in a private room. A revolutionary idea might slumber there for generations, seen only by a select few, while the world outside continued to build using the older, sanctioned methods. The Book of Secrets protected the guild's power, but in doing so, it also imprisoned the very knowledge it was meant to preserve. The price for a single window could bankrupt a small noble estate. When a cathedral chapter commissioned its grand rose window, they were not simply buying colored glass and lead. They were purchasing access to a mystery, a skill so tightly guarded that only a handful of families in all of Europe were said to possess it. The master glassmaker's fee was astronomical, justified by the whispered secret of his unique formula for crimson glass, a color that seemed to hold sunlight within it like liquid fire. This was the guild's economic engine in motion, where secrecy was meticulously converted into gold. By framing their craft not as a trade but as a rare and almost alchemical art, guilds detached their labor from ordinary market rates. A carpenter who could build a sturdy house was paid for his time and materials. A master carpenter of the guild, who knew the secret joinery for a self-supporting roof that defied gravity, was paid for his profound, exclusive knowledge. His price was not a calculation of hours, but a valuation of the mystery itself. This strategy created a powerful feedback loop that enriched the guilds and elevated their social standing. The higher their fees, the more they could invest in symbols of their exclusivity. Magnificent guild halls adorned with intricate carvings that only they could fully understand, and lavish ceremonial dinners where members wore special regalia. These displays were not mere vanity, they were marketing. They visually reinforced the distance between the guild brother and the common artisan, making their skills appear even more rare and desirable. The economic power this generated was immense and self-sustaining. Wealth from exclusive contracts funded the very rituals and secrecy that justified the next exclusive contract. A lord seeking to build a chapel would naturally seek out the most prestigious, expensive guild, believing their higher cost guaranteed divine favor and eternal structural integrity. Thus, the monopoly became a closed circuit. The secret protected the skill's mystery inflated its price, and the accumulated wealth fortified the walls guarding the secret. This cycle did more than make master craftsmen wealthy. It fundamentally distorted local economies. It concentrated capital and influence in the hands of a few closed societies, making communities dependent not just on their skills, but on their willingness to sell those skills at a premium. The true product was not the stained glass or the stone arch, but the exclusive right to create it, a right the guilds held in an iron grip. A king's seal could turn secrecy into sovereignty. The most powerful defense the guilds possessed was not a hidden symbol or a locked chest, but a formal document stamped with royal authority. This was the charter, a legal instrument that transformed a private brotherhood into a public institution with the full force of the state behind it. When a monarch granted a charter to the Guild of Masons or the Fellowship of Rights, he was doing far more than offering a polite endorsement. He was granting them an exclusive franchise, the sole legal right to practice their specific craft within the boundaries of a city, a county, or sometimes an entire kingdom. This was not a suggestion, it was enforceable law. If an independent carpenter, no matter how skilled, tried to set up a shop within that territory, he was not just facing the guild's disapproval. He was breaking the king's law. The guild could bring him before the royal justices, and the penalties were severe: confiscation of his tools, destruction of his work, heavy fines, or banishment from the city. This legal armor made the guild's monopoly nearly unassailable from below. Their control over engineering knowledge was no longer just a matter of tradition or competitive advantage. It was now a legally protected commodity, as tangible and defensible as a parcel of land. Historians point to court records from cities like London and Paris where guilds routinely sued, or prosecuted independent craftsmen for infringement. In one noted case, a talented metalworker who developed a new method for forging stronger hinges was taken to court not for theft, but for practicing without a guild license. His innovation was irrelevant. His legal status was the only thing that mattered. The court's ruling reinforced the system. His workshop was shut down and his tools were forfeit. This deep intertwining with political power created a symbiotic relationship. Kings and town councils received reliable, high-quality work for their castles and cathedrals from a controlled, predictable source. In return, the guilds received legal protection from competition, which guaranteed their wealth and stability. This relationship turned engineering knowledge into a pillar of state power. A monarch who controlled the guilds, in effect, controlled the very means of building his realm's infrastructure, its defenses, and its symbols of authority. The secret of the perfect arch was now protected not just by a master's oath, but by the sheriff and the court. This fusion of knowledge, law, and politics created a fortress of privilege that would stand for centuries, shaping the landscape of innovation in ways we are still unraveling today. The skyline of medieval Europe was rewritten in stone and light, a testament to a monopoly in action. To stand before the soaring vaults of Chartres Cathedral or the immense, unfinished spires of Cologne is to witness the ultimate product of the guild system. These were not just buildings, they were century-long endeavors, projects so vast they outlived every king, bishop, and master mason who first conceived them. Managing such an undertaking required more than pious labor. It demanded an administrative and engineering machine of breathtaking complexity, and that machine was the stonemasons' guild. They alone held the specialized knowledge to turn a spiritual vision into physical reality. The most critical secret was not in the decorative carvings, but in the bones of the building itself, a field called stereotomy, the art of cutting and fitting stone. A single arch in a Gothic rib vault might be composed of dozens of uniquely shaped stones, each one a three-dimensional puzzle piece that had to be precisely calculated, cut miles away at the quarry, and then assembled perfectly on site, often hundreds of feet in the air. The master mason's secret notebooks contained the templates for these stones, diagrams that were guarded more closely than any map to buried treasure. This knowledge was power in its purest form, the power to make stone defy gravity. That power was amplified by their control over the machines of construction. The Great Treadmill Crane, a massive wooden wheel powered by men walking inside it like a giant hamster wheel, was the medieval equivalent of a modern construction crane. Its design, operation, and the complex physics of its load-bearing capacities were guild secrets. To control the crane was to control the pace and very possibility of construction. But the guild's monopoly extended beyond the physical into the realm of the sacred. The designs for these cathedrals were believed to be based on divine geometry, perfect ratios and proportions that mirrored the harmony of the cosmos. Knowledge of this geometry, of how to lay out the entire footprint of a cathedral using just a cord and stakes, was considered a form of spiritual insight. The guilds guarded this sacred mathematics as fiercely as they guarded their stone-cutting templates, framing it not as mere calculation, but as a mystical revelation earned only through years of initiation. This fusion of practical engineering and sacred secrecy placed immense cultural authority in their hands. They were not just builders, they were the mediators between heaven and earth, the sole possessors of the knowledge required to create a gateway to the divine. The result was a societal marvel that still inspires awe, a monument to human aspiration made possible by a tightly controlled, closed system of knowledge. The cathedral, in all its glory, stands as the ultimate symbol of what the guild monopoly could achieve, and a permanent reminder of the immense power concentrated in the hands of those who hold the keys to how our world is built. A master's secret formula could be condemned from the pulpit. The profound tension between the artisan guilds and the church was not just about power, but about the very nature of creation itself. For while the church was the era's greatest patron, commissioning the cathedrals that were the guild's lifeblood, it also held a deep theological suspicion of any knowledge that seemed to rival divine prerogative. The guilds, especially those working with metals, pigments, or the very elements, often operated in a dangerous gray zone. Their most advanced practical engineering brushed against what was then called natural philosophy, the study of the physical world's hidden forces. To transform base ore into gleaming steel, or to concoct a glaze that turned fire into permanent jewel-like color, looked to some clerical eyes alarmingly like playing God. This was knowledge that could be labeled not just proprietary but heretical. A metalworking guild's closely guarded recipe for a stronger alloy might be seen as an attempt to improve upon God's creation, a challenge to the belief that nature, in its current state, was a perfect and finished work. The alchemists, who existed in a shadowy overlap between early chemistry, metallurgy, and mysticism, faced this scrutiny most directly. Their pursuit of transmutation was the ultimate forbidden innovation, a direct assault on the perceived natural order. To navigate this peril, the guilds became masters of a delicate double game. They publicly wrapped their entire enterprise in a cloak of orthodox piety. Every major craft had a patron saint, Saint Joseph for the carpenters, Saint Eligius for the metalworkers. Guild halls featured altars, members marched together in religious processions, and their charters were often blessed by bishops. This was far more than simple devotion. It was a strategic shield. By loudly aligning themselves with the approved symbols and rituals of the faith, they created a layer of protection. It became far harder for a local cleric to accuse the men who built his own church's altar of engaging in dark arts. They framed their secrets not as challenges to theology, but as gifts granted by God to pious men for the beautification of his houses. The complex geometry used in their designs was spoken of as sacred geometry, a glimpse into the mind of the Creator, not a human invention. This brilliant maneuver allowed potentially radical practical knowledge to flourish in the shadows, sheltered by the very institution that might otherwise have sought to suppress it. The guilds learned that to protect an unorthodox method, you must surround it with orthodox ceremony. A new timber joint could be seen as a form of treason. The guild's monopoly extended beyond guarding their own secrets to actively suppressing any knowledge that originated outside their walls. Consider a brilliant carpenter, perhaps the son of a shipwright, who observed how the overlapping joints in a hull withstood immense pressure at sea. He adapts this principle, creating a new, interlocking joint for roof beams that requires less massive timber and is demonstrably stronger. He presents it to the local carpenters' guild, hoping for recognition. Instead, he meets a wall of institutional resistance. The guild masters are not evaluating his idea on pure engineering merit. They are assessing a threat. Their entire economic system is built on the standard use of local oak, cut and prepared using their time-honored, guild-controlled methods. Their carefully maintained pricing, their relationships with specific foresters, even the very tools their apprentices learn to use, are all calibrated for that one way of working. This new joint, which might use wood more efficiently and challenge established practices, is not progress to them. It is an attack on their ecosystem. To dismantle this threat, the guilds wielded a powerful, legalistic tool, the right of assay. This was their sanctioned authority to inspect and approve all materials and workmanship within their domain. A guild assayer, an elder master, would visit a construction site or a workshop. His stamp of approval was mandatory for a builder to be paid. When confronted with an innovative method or an unfamiliar material, the assayer had immense discretionary power. He could declare the new brick-making process untested, or the unfamiliar timber joint a deviation from the tried and true principles of the craft. His word, backed by guild authority and civic law, was final. This was not always corruption in a simple sense, it was a profound bias toward the inherited system. The Guild's definition of quality had become synonymous with the way we have always done it. Through this control over inspection, they could effectively blacklist innovation without ever debating its merits. Furthermore, their influence reached into the very contracts that funded construction. Town councils and wealthy patrons relied on guild advice when drawing up specifications for a new bridge or Guildhall. A master whispering that a new type of mortar was unproven or that a novel iron fastener might fail with time could ensure the contract explicitly mandated traditional materials and methods, locking out competitors before a single stone was laid. The result was a landscape of frozen technology, a safer scaffolding design, a more efficient plowshare, a cheaper roofing tile. All could vanish not because they didn't work, but because they worked too well, threatening the intricate economy of secrecy and control. Progress became a prisoner to precedent, and the cost was paid in stagnation, in buildings that were more expensive than they needed to be, and in ideas that were buried not by ignorance but by deliberate, organized suppression. A sealed letter of introduction was a master's passport, but his mind was a smuggler's ship. The guild system, for all its legal and territorial fortifications, could never fully contain the most unpredictable element of all, the ambitious, curious human being. The figure of the itinerant master craftsman represents a vital crack in the monolithic facade. These were men of such renowned skill that their fame, and the sheer demand for their expertise, overrode local guild restrictions. A German master clockmaker, his head filled with revolutionary designs for intricate astronomical gears, might receive a personal invitation from an Italian duke. A French master mason, celebrated for his work on a cathedral's impossible spire, could be summoned by an English king desperate to outbuild his rivals. They traveled with a guild's formal letter of recommendation, a document meant to control and legitimize their movement. But once they arrived in a foreign land, they carried something far more disruptive, knowledge untethered from its original vault. In the workshop of a distant castle or a rising abbey, these masters did not work in isolation. They directed local laborers and journeymen. In the daily process of explaining how to cut a peculiar stone or assemble a complex mechanical clock, secrets inevitably seeped out. A local apprentice, sharp-eyed and eager, might grasp the underlying principle of a foreign master's technique, a principle never before seen in that region. This created a quiet, persistent form of knowledge transfer, a slow drip of innovation that bypassed the official, guarded channels. Unsurprisingly, this leakage often sparked fierce conflict. Local guilds viewed these celebrated interlopers with deep suspicion. They were a double-edged sword. Their prestige could elevate a project and bring reflected glory to the town, but their presence also undermined the local guild's monopoly on know-how. Tensions could flare over jurisdiction, payment, and most critically, over who had the right to teach. There are records of local guilds petitioning town councils to restrict the foreign master's activities, demanding he work only with materials they supplied or forbidding him from taking on local apprentices. In some cases, the conflict turned physical, with guild members attempting to sabotage the outsider's work or bar him from the worksite. Yet, the very existence of these traveling experts proves the monopoly had its limits. Royal or papal authority could trump local guild charters. Pure economic necessity, the urgent need for a specific skill that no local possessed, could force a city to open its gates. The itinerant master became a living paradox, a testament to the guild's power, for only a guild-trained master could attain such renown and simultaneously a vulnerability in their system. He was a vector, a carrier of ideas across the sealed borders of medieval knowledge. His journey reminds us that even the most rigid structures cannot completely stifle the human drive to learn, to share, and to seek opportunity beyond the walls of the familiar. The system was powerful, but it was never perfectly sealed. The true seat of power was not the cathedral site, but a fortified house of stone and timber in the city's center. The Guildhall stood as a physical declaration, an architecture of exclusion that made the monopoly visible to every citizen. To walk past its heavy oak doors was to pass a boundary, to move from the public world of the market into the private realm of a sovereign craft. This building was far more than a workshop or a meeting place. It was a temple of secrecy, a fortress for knowledge, and the beating heart of the entire system. Within its thick walls, every strand of the guild's power was gathered and given a permanent home. The ground floor might house a spacious meeting hall with a high, beamed ceiling, where masters gathered at a long table to set prices, settle disputes, and decide the fate of apprentices. The atmosphere here was one of sober administration, the air smelling of waxed wood and old parchment. In a locked strongroom, the guild's treasury was kept, coins and bullion representing generations of exclusive contracts. Up a narrow staircase, accessible only to senior masters, lay the most guarded space of all, the scriptorium or archive. Here, in chests bound with iron, the secret manuscripts and template drawings were stored, often alongside the guild's charter and its ceremonial regalia. Light in this room was controlled, coming from high, narrow windows, ensuring prying eyes could not glimpse the treasures within. But the Guildhall's function was not merely practical, it was profoundly symbolic and ritualistic. In its great hall, initiations were conducted under the watchful eyes of carved patron saints. A journeyman, having proven his masterpiece, would kneel here to take a solemn oath of loyalty, swearing to uphold the guild's secrets and traditions. The space itself, often the finest secular building in the city after the church and the Lord's castle, communicated permanence and legitimacy. Its ornate facade, carved with the tools of the trade rendered in stone, told the public that this brotherhood was an eternal fixture, as solid and enduring as the masonry it represented. For the member, crossing the threshold was an act of belonging, a return to a sanctuary where his unique status was recognized and revered. For the outsider, the building was a cold statement of impossibility, its closed doors a reminder that the most valuable knowledge in the community was curated behind barriers they could never cross. The Guildhall made the abstract concept of a monopoly concrete, turning it into a landmark you could see, walk around, but never truly enter. It was the ultimate consolidation, where law, economy, ritual, and secrecy fused into a single, intimidating edifice, proving that power in the medieval world required not just a secret but a headquarters. A master's signature was not just in his work, but in the very weight of his hammer. The fifth and most tangible layer of the guild's monopoly lay in their absolute control over the physical instruments of creation. Engineering knowledge lived not only in the mind but was forged into steel and carved into wood. A master locksmith's unique set of files, each one shaped and tempered by his own hand over decades, was as proprietary as the complex lock mechanisms they were used to create. A shipwright's adze, its handle worn smooth by generations of palms, carried the subtle, unspoken technique for shaping a hull's curve. These tools were not mere commodities, they were extensions of the craftsman's body and the living repositories of his guild's accumulated skill. Consequently, guilds moved to regulate the very pipeline of these instruments. They often controlled which blacksmiths were permitted to forge specialized chisels for stone carving, or which woodturners could produce the precise bobbins used in weaving guild looms. An outsider, no matter how theoretically knowledgeable, faced an immediate and practical barrier. Even if you had somehow learned the principles of stained glass from a stolen glance at a manuscript, where would you acquire the special grozing irons and lead knives required to actually cut and assemble the glass? The answer was often nowhere unless you were a guild member with access to their sanctioned suppliers. This control extended dramatically into the realm of large-scale machinery. The design for a great treadmill crane, a Fulling Mill's complex waterwheel mechanism, or an advanced horizontal loom represented a massive capital investment and a profound competitive advantage. The guild that owned such a machine owned a piece of the local economy's infrastructure. The detailed plans for their construction and repair were guarded as fiercely as any architectural secret. To own or operate one without guild sanction was not just illegal, it was practically impossible, as the specialized parts and the knowledge to assemble them were deliberately kept within the brotherhood. This created a devastatingly effective choke point. It meant that even if a brilliant individual understood the geometry of a flying buttress or the mechanics of a windmill, executing that knowledge at a scale that could compete with the guild was out of reach. They were barred not by law or oath alone, but by the sheer physical absence of the means to build. The monopoly thus became embodied in objects you could hold in your hand or stand beneath in awe, turning abstract control into something as solid and unyielding as iron. The master mason's widow now held the keys to the workshop. When her husband passed, the official guild records might list her as merely the caretaker of his estate, but in practice, she became the operational heart of the business. She knew every client, the details of every outstanding contract, and the subtle art of negotiating with suppliers for the best stone. She managed the apprentices, ensured the accounts were settled, and maintained the workshop's reputation for reliability. While the guild's formal meetings were closed to her, her home became the de facto headquarters, a space where the practical knowledge of running a craft enterprise was preserved and exercised. This was a powerful, yet largely invisible, role. Women were the unseen keepers of the logistical and relational knowledge that allowed the grand projects to function at all. Their expertise formed a critical, parallel system that supported the formal male-dominated structure from the ground up. In some trades, women's participation was more direct, though still carefully circumscribed. They were commonly admitted into what were considered lesser guilds, those associated with textiles like silk weaving or embroidery, and in brewing, where the production of ale was often a household enterprise. Here, women could rise to the rank of master in their own right, managing businesses and training apprentices. Their guilds operated with the same protective secrecy over techniques for creating a prized crimson dye or a particularly clear, stable ale. This proves that the guild model itself was not inherently closed to women, but its application in the prestigious, high-status crafts of engineering and masonry certainly was. Within craft families, however, the walls between official and unofficial knowledge were porous. In the long evenings in a carpenter's home, a daughter might learn the properties of different woods by helping to prepare materials. A metalsmith's wife would understand the stages of the forge's fire, not from formal training, but from a lifetime of observation and assisting with the family's livelihood. These individuals became informal repositories of technique, holding pieces of the craft's puzzle even if they were barred from assembling the final, public masterpiece. This created a hidden network of understanding, a domestic circulation of vital practical knowledge that the formal monopoly could not fully contain. The widow who smoothly took over the accounts, the daughter who could identify a flaw in a timber's grain, the sister in a weaving guild who guarded a pattern secret, all represent a subtle but profound truth. While the public face of engineering knowledge was a sealed fraternity, its lifeblood often flowed through the entire household, sustained by those history seldom names as engineers. Their story suggests the monopoly was never quite as absolute as its charters declared, for it always depended on a foundation of unofficial, indispensable expertise that operated just outside the light of official record. A cathedral might stand for 1,000 years, but the ideas that built it could be frozen in place for generations. The very system that preserved and perfected engineering knowledge carried within it a powerful bias against change. How many simpler bridges, stronger roofs, or more efficient mills were never built, not for a lack of genius, but because they threatened a guild's carefully guarded income. The monopoly, designed for stability, often bred a deep and institutionalized conservatism. Protecting the secret meant protecting the status quo, and any innovation that could devalue a master's lifelong training was viewed not as progress, but as a direct assault on the guild's foundation. Historical analysis of guild records reveals clear periods, sometimes spanning decades, where architectural styles or mechanical techniques in a region showed little evolution. The blueprint for a watermill or the design for a common house became standardized, not because they were perfect, but because they were safe. The guild's right of assay, its power to approve all work, became a tool to enforce this sameness. A journeyman proposing a novel joint for a timber frame might be told it deviated from the true principles of the craft. His innovation rejected not on its merits, but because it challenged the established, guild-controlled way of doing things. This resistance extended to any device or method that promised to make the work easier or faster. The introduction of a new type of saw that could cut stone more quickly, for example, might be opposed by master masons who saw it as a threat. If the task required less time and skill, would their labor not be devalued? Would it not allow less trained workers to encroach on their exclusive domain? The fear was not of the tool itself, but of what it represented, a potential crack in the wall of exclusivity that kept their knowledge scarce and expensive. This inherent caution, born from the need to defend the monopoly, could slowly strangle the spirit of experimentation. Why risk testing a new mortar formula when the old one, while imperfect, was legally sanctioned and guaranteed your contract? The guild's great strength, its ability to maintain quality and continuity across centuries, became its subtle weakness. It prioritized the preservation of existing power structures over the messy, unpredictable, and often disruptive process of discovery. In safeguarding the secrets of the past, they sometimes locked away the possibilities of the future, proving that the cost of perfect control can be measured in the quiet, forgotten potential of what might have been. The formula for the perfect blade was a secret worth killing for. While guilds projected an image of brotherly unity to the outside world, the reality within their closed circles was often a simmering Cold War. The most intense battles were not fought against unlicensed craftsmen, but between rival guilds in competing cities, each vying for the contracts that would define their wealth and prestige for a generation. Consider the smiths of Milan and Toledo, both legendary for their steel. If the Milanese guild discovered a rumor that the Toldens had perfected a new quenching technique, producing blades of unparalleled flexibility and sharpness, their entire economic standing was at stake. They could not simply innovate faster. The monopoly mindset dictated a different path: espionage. The first target in this shadow war was often the weakest link in the guild's chain of secrecy, the disgruntled apprentice. A young man, weary of years of menial work and harsh discipline, might be approached in a tavern by a stranger with a heavy purse. The offer was simple: a description of the master's workshop layout, the location of his private ledger, or the timing of the alloy mixing process. For a handful of silver, the guild's most guarded spaces could be laid bare. More sophisticated operations involved planting a spy, a journeyman from a rival city, bearing forged letters of recommendation, would apply for work in the target guild's shop. His true mission was not to learn the craft, but to observe and memorize. He would note the exact sequence of heating and folding the metal, the unusual ingredients added to the quenching oil, the cryptic marks made on the furnace to indicate temperature. This stolen knowledge would be encoded in letters sent home, piece by piece, slowly reconstructing the rival's masterpiece technique across a distance of hundreds of miles. The stakes of this clandestine struggle sometimes escalated beyond theft to active sabotage. There are accounts from city chronicles of mysterious fires destroying a competitor's warehouse of specially prepared materials, or of critical tools being damaged just before a major demonstration for a wealthy patron. These acts were rarely prosecuted openly, as guilds were loath to admit their vulnerabilities, but they created an atmosphere of deep suspicion and internal policing. This relentless, competitive secrecy had a paradoxical effect. On one hand, the constant fear of being overtaken could drive a guild to refine its own methods, leading to incremental improvements as masters sought to stay one step ahead. On the other, it led to immense waste. Two guilds, separated by a mountain range, might spend decades and fortunes independently trying to solve the same metallurgical puzzle, duplicating effort in isolation because sharing a breakthrough was unthinkable. The knowledge was a contested asset, its value defined not just by its utility but by its exclusivity. This internal warfare reveals the darker, more chaotic engine within the system. The drive to hoard knowledge could twist brotherhood into rivalry and turn the workshop, that supposed sanctuary of shared craft, into a fortress where every apprentice might be an enemy agent. It was a high-stakes game where the prize was not just a better product, but the very right to define what better meant. The collapse of a scaffold was never just an accident. When a wooden framework high on a cathedral wall gave way, sending timber and stone crashing to the ground, the official explanation from the guildmasters was a carefully crafted shield. They might speak of unforeseen stresses in the stone, of a sudden, freak gust of wind, or even suggest it was a mysterious test of faith. The one explanation you would never hear was that a guild brother had miscalculated the load, or that their secret method for lashing the timbers was fundamentally flawed. Controlling the narrative of failure was as vital as guarding the recipe for stained glass. By framing disasters as acts of God or complex, unavoidable natural events, the guilds protected something far more valuable than their reputation for safety. They protected the perceived infallibility of their secret knowledge itself. If the public ever believed the guarded techniques could be wrong, the entire foundation of their monopoly would crumble. This strategic storytelling fed directly into a powerful cultural phenomenon, the cult of the master. In guild-sponsored tales and public celebrations, innovation was not presented as the result of open debate or trial and error. It was always the brilliant flash of insight from a single, almost mystical figure, a genius whose mind had been unlocked by years of secret initiation. The master was portrayed as a solitary hero, his authority flowing not from demonstrable, teachable logic, but from his unique proximity to the craft's mysteries. This created a powerful cultural monopoly on expertise. Who could possibly challenge the judgment of such a man? An outsider, no matter how observant or logically sound their critique of a bridge design, lacked the sacred authority bestowed by the guild's rituals. They had not sworn the oaths, learned the hand signs, or seen the hidden manuscripts. Their arguments could be dismissed not on merit, but on the simple grounds that they were not initiated. This made the system incredibly resistant to correction from within or scrutiny from without. A junior journeyman who spotted a potential weakness in a master's plan would risk his entire career by speaking up, challenging the very cult of genius he was trying to enter. The system elevated the individual's secret-inspired revelation over collaborative, transparent problem-solving. It meant that errors, when they did occur, were buried under layers of mystification instead of being analyzed and learned from. The true cost was a stifling of healthy skepticism and a slowing of iterative improvement. Progress became linked not to the best idea, but to the idea of the anointed master, leaving brilliant alternatives silenced in the shadows, unheard simply because they arrived without the password. The master glassmaker's furnace glowed with a light that seemed to hold secrets of the sun itself. In workshops like his, and in the foundries where bronze was coaxed into thunderous bells, the line between skilled craft and early science dissolved into the smoke. This was the realm where engineering met alchemy, a space of transformative fire where materials were not just shaped, but fundamentally reborn. The most powerful guilds were those who mastered this ambiguous territory, guarding not merely a method, but what felt like a fragment of elemental power. Their closely held recipes were often born from centuries of patient, dangerous experimentation, a slow accumulation of what worked, written down in a language designed to confuse the uninitiated. A formula for a deep blue glass might be recorded not as a list of minerals, but as a poetic allegory involving the marriage of the sky and the sea, with instructions tied to phases of the moon. This was not mere superstition, it was a brilliant strategy of obfuscation. By wrapping an empirical process like adding cobalt oxide to molten silica in layers of symbolic ritual, the guild protected its economic lifeblood. It transformed a practical technique into a philosophical mystery, making it far harder for a rival to simply observe and replicate. The apprentice learned not just the steps, but the entire ceremonial theater that surrounded them, the chants, the precise order of adding ingredients, the reading of the flame's color. This holistic control meant that understanding the secret required buying into the entire worldview of the guild. You could not steal the recipe without first understanding the symbolism, and you could not understand the symbolism without being initiated. This placed these guilds at the absolute forefront of medieval material technology. The search for the perfect bell metal, a bronze alloy that would ring clear and true without cracking, was a pursuit that blended metallurgy with a near-spiritual quest for harmonic purity. Each failure, each bell that shattered upon cooling or rang with a dull tone, added to a guarded library of hard-won knowledge about impurities, cooling times, and the spiritual dimensions of sound. In this way, the alchemical mindset, with its focus on transmutation and perfection, provided a powerful framework for incremental engineering advances. It encouraged generations of masters to ask, what if we try this mineral or heat it for this much longer? The answers, however, were never published. They were encoded, locked within the guild's symbolic language, turning every material breakthrough into a deeper mystery. The monopoly here was total. It controlled the physical recipe, the philosophical context, and the very narrative of how the material world could be mastered. To own the secret of crimson glass was to own a piece of captured light, and to guard it was to hold a key to the borderland where human craft touched the forces of nature itself. A locked guild chest could be picked by a mass-produced book. The quiet, methodical revolution of the printing press did not arrive with the clamor of a siege engine, but with the steady, rhythmic thump of a press and the faint smell of ink. For centuries, the guild's power had been built on a simple, physical fact that engineering knowledge was scarce, fragile, and anchored to a single location. A master's secret lived in one manuscript, in one locked chest, in one Guildhall. The printing press changed that fundamental equation forever. Suddenly, a detailed technical manual on geometry, architecture, or metallurgy could be reproduced not just once, but hundreds of times, and those copies could travel on merchant carts to cities where the local guild held no sway. The first wave of printed books often seemed to uphold the old order, beautifully illustrated treatises that celebrated the established masters and their divine proportions. Yet, the very act of putting this information into print, even in a respectful form, began to erode the foundation of exclusivity. A secret, once printed, was no longer a secret, it was a publication. It existed in multiple places at once, beyond the reach of any single guild strongroom. This created a new and unsettling possibility: the independent scholar or ingenious artisan working outside the guild system. A man in a small town with access to a printed book on perspective and mechanics could now teach himself principles that were once the exclusive birthright of a 7-year apprenticeship. More dangerously, from the guild's perspective, he could publish his own ideas. For the first time, a critique of a standard building technique or a proposal for a novel water pump could be circulated widely without needing the approval of a guild's senior masters. The information landscape, once a series of walled gardens, was becoming an open field. The guilds did not vanish overnight. Their legal charters and deep social roots ensured their survival for centuries. But their ability to enforce a total blackout on engineering principles was broken. Knowledge began a slow, irreversible migration from the private vault into the public sphere, a process that would ultimately transform not just how things were built, but who had the right to build them. The Grand Hall was a spectacle of belonging. On the feast day of their patron saint, the guild brothers did not simply gather for a meal. They performed their unity before the entire city. Clad in matching livery, cloaks of a specific deep blue trimmed with silver thread, they marched in solemn procession from their hall to the cathedral. To the watching townsfolk, this was not a parade of workers, but a living tapestry of power and exclusivity. The feast that followed was an even more potent ritual. Held in their private hall, it was a symphony of controlled abundance. The long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats and fine imported wines, but the true nourishment was social. Seating was arranged by seniority, apprentices at one end, journeymen in the middle, and the masters at the head table beneath the guild's carved emblem. Here, in the warmth of shared food and drink, bonds were fortified, stories of past projects were told, reputations were made, and the unspoken rules of the brotherhood were absorbed through sheer osmosis. This was not mere celebration. It was a continuous reinforcement of the hierarchy that kept the secrets safe. To be included was to taste a privilege denied to 99% of the population. To be excluded was to be cast into professional and social darkness. The most profound of these social rituals was the initiation ceremony. When a journeyman was finally deemed worthy to become a master, the event was shrouded in solemn theater. Often conducted at night within the guild hall, the candidate would be led before the assembled masters. He might be asked a series of cryptic questions about the craft's principles, his answers judged not just for technical accuracy, but for their reflection of the guild's philosophical spirit. The climax was the oath. The candidate would place his hand upon a relic, perhaps a bone fragment of Saint Eligius for metalworkers or a splinter from the true cross owned by the guild, and swear a binding vow. He pledged not only to uphold the standards of the craft, but to guard its secrets with his life and honor, to never reveal them to the uninitiated, even under threat. This oath transformed the act of sharing a technical diagram from a simple breach of contract into a sacred betrayal, a spiritual transgression that would damn his soul and sever him from his brothers forever. These ceremonies and social structures made the monopoly inescapably personal. The guild's knowledge was not just locked in a chest, it was woven into the very identity of the member. His livelihood, his social standing, his spiritual well-being, and his deepest friendships were all entangled with his silence. To betray a secret was to betray himself and everyone he broke bread with. The economic and legal walls around the knowledge were formidable, but the social and ceremonial walls were perhaps the most impregnable of all. They turned the guild hall into a sanctuary and the outside world into a realm of potential corruption, ensuring that the most dangerous threat to the monopoly would never come from within. The king's greatest weapon was not a sword but a workshop. Within the fortified walls of a royal armory, the air rang with a different kind of secrecy, one measured in the weight of iron and the range of a projectile. Here, the guilds of armorers, bowires, and siege engineers operated under a new, more urgent imperative: technological supremacy in the theater of war. The knowledge to forge a suit of plate armor that could turn a land strike, or to calculate the precise counterweight for a trebuchet to shatter a castle wall at 300 paces, was not merely a trade secret, it was a matter of national security. The guilds that mastered these arts became extensions of the state's military power, bound to their patrons by a relationship of profound mutual dependence. The crown provided the ultimate legal monopoly, a mandate that often overrode all local guild rivalries, and a continuous flow of royal funds for materials and experimentation. In return, the guilds delivered a decisive edge on the battlefield. This alliance transformed military engineering guilds into the most secretive and protected of all. Their workshops were often located within castle precincts under constant guard. An armorer's formula for tempering steel, which produced a blade that could slice through chainmail, was guarded as closely as the battle plans it would help execute. The state had a direct interest in ensuring these secrets never leaked to an enemy kingdom, so the penalties for betrayal were severe, often considered acts of treason punishable by the highest authorities. This symbiosis accelerated innovation, but within a tightly controlled, shadowed corridor. The drive to build a better crossbow or a more mobile siege tower funneled immense resources into these closed groups, making their members indispensable. A master siege engineer could command the respect of generals, his value calculated not in coins, but in the gates he could breach and the fortresses he could make impregnable. Their knowledge translated directly into political and martial dominance, turning the gears of what we might call the medieval military-industrial complex. In this high-stakes arena, the guild's traditional secrecy was amplified by the existential needs of the state, creating a fortress within a fortress, where the next great advance in the art of war was hammered out on an anvil, surrounded by silence and royal favor. The blueprint for a modern profession was drafted in a medieval Guildhall. When you look at a licensed architect reviewing plans, a master electrician supervising an apprentice, or a software engineer guarding a proprietary algorithm, you are seeing the distant echo of a system perfected centuries ago. The guilds themselves dissolved, their monopolies shattered by new laws and the relentless spread of printed knowledge, but their fundamental architecture for managing expertise proved astonishingly resilient. Their core innovation was not any single secret of mortar or metal, but the very concept of organizing skilled labor into a tiered, self-regulating body. The journey from apprentice to journeyman to master is a direct ancestor of our modern pathways in trades and professions. That young person learning to weld under a certified supervisor is walking a path first formalized by the stonemasons' guilds, a structured progression from novice to independent practitioner based on demonstrated competence. The masterpiece evolved into the licensing exam, the bar exam for lawyers, or the professional engineering certification. These are not arbitrary hurdles, they are modernized versions of the guild's assurance of quality, a public promise that the holder possesses a verified, standardized level of skill. Even the ethical codes that bind doctors, lawyers, and engineers today find a precursor in the guild oaths. While those medieval vows centered on protecting secrets and brotherhood, the underlying principle is the same. A professional's work is governed by a set of standards that transcend the individual job, creating a bond of trust with the society they serve. Perhaps the most pervasive legacy is in the very idea of intellectual property. The guild's locked chest of secret manuscripts was an early, physical form of patent. Their understanding that unique knowledge had economic value and deserved protection from theft laid the philosophical groundwork for our complex modern systems of copyrights, trademarks, and trade secrets. A tech company's fiercely guarded source code is the spiritual successor to the glassmaker's encrypted formula. The crucial difference, of course, is one of scale and openness. Modern systems aim, however imperfectly, to balance protection with the public good, eventually releasing knowledge into the commons, whereas the guilds aimed for perpetual secrecy. Their restrictive monopolies could not survive in a world of expanding literacy and global trade, but the framework they built for training, certifying, and ethically organizing specialized knowledge was simply too effective to discard. It was adapted, reformed, and stripped of its most exclusionary elements, but its skeleton remains. So the next time you see a union card, a professional license, or a confidentiality agreement, remember you are looking at the ghost of the guild, a testament to the enduring human need to structure excellence, to distinguish the novice from the master, and to find a way to trust in the invisible quality of another person's skill. The locked guild chest now lives in a climate-controlled server farm. The parallels between those medieval brotherhoods and today's technology giants are not just metaphorical, they are structural, revealing a timeless struggle over who controls the tools that shape our world. Consider the proprietary algorithm, the closely guarded sequence of code that determines what you see on a social media feed or an online marketplace. This is the modern equivalent of the Master Mason's secret geometry, a digital book of secrets that creates immense value and is protected with equal ferocity. Tech corporations, like the guilds before them, have constructed formidable ecosystems around this knowledge. Access is controlled not through a 7-year apprenticeship, but through elite university degrees in computer science and a labyrinth of non-disclosure agreements that bind employees to silence. The economic model is strikingly familiar, hoarding unique knowledge to create a product or service so essential that it commands premium prices and creates profound market dependency. A town once needed the guild to build its bridge. Today, a business or even a government may need a specific software platform to function, locking them into an ongoing relationship with a single corporate entity. Political influence wielded is also a direct parallel. Medieval guilds secured royal charters, tech companies lobby for favorable regulations, and intellectual property laws that fortify their monopolies. Both systems create a powerful feedback loop where control of knowledge generates wealth, and that wealth is used to secure greater legal and political control, further insulating the core secrets from competition. This is not to say the comparison is perfect, or that modern technology is a sinister cabal. The benefits of these concentrated systems are real. They can drive rapid, well-funded innovation and create globally consistent, reliable platforms. Yet, understanding the guilds gives us a crucial historical lens. It forces us to ask the same fundamental questions that echoed in medieval town squares. What is the true cost when the most powerful knowledge in a society is held behind legal and digital walls? Does the drive to protect a competitive advantage inevitably slow the wider, collaborative progress of humanity? The tension between open innovation and protected advantage is not a relic, it is the defining battle of our information age. By studying how medieval societies navigated and were sometimes constrained by their knowledge monopolies, we gain a sobering framework to critically examine our own. The stakes have changed, but the core drama of who gets to build the future and who must live within its walls remains hauntingly familiar. The guild's walls of silence were never quite as soundproof as they intended. For every secret oath sworn in a candlelit hall, a mundane receipt was filed away in a city archive. The very bureaucracy the guilds built to enforce their monopoly now serves as the key to unlocking it. Historians today act as forensic detectives, sifting through mountains of indirect evidence to reconstruct a world designed to leave no blueprints behind. Their primary sources are not the secret manuscripts, which were often destroyed or lost, but the everyday paperwork the system could not function without. Meticulous guild financial records, preserved in civic vaults, reveal astonishing details. An entry for the purchase of an unusually large quantity of Baltic oak in a town with no shipyards points to a major timber frame project. A payment ledger showing regular wages to a specific group of masons over decades, rather than seasonal laborers, outlines the permanent, professional core of a cathedral worksite. These dry numbers and lists, never meant for outside eyes, now sketch the organizational skeleton of the monopoly. Court records provide another rich vein of accidental confession. When a guild sued an independent craftsman for infringement, or when members were brought before the city council for a dispute over fees, the proceedings were meticulously recorded. In defending their exclusive rights, guild masters were forced to describe, in legal terms, the very boundaries of their craft and the methods they claimed to own. A lawsuit over a stolen tool design might include a detailed description of that tool's unique function. A case about a broken contract might reveal the standard timeline for an apprenticeship or the specific stages of a complex construction process. In their efforts to protect their secrets through law, the guilds inadvertently created a public record of their professional world. Beyond parchment, the stones and tools themselves speak to those who know how to listen. Archaeologists and architectural historians practice a form of reverse engineering, studying the finished product to deduce the lost process. By analyzing the tool marks on a medieval beam, experts can determine the type of saw used and the skill level of the carpenter. The precise geometry of a vault, when measured and plotted, can reveal the underlying mathematical rules the masons followed, even if those rules were never written down in a form we can read. The choice of materials tells a story of trade networks and guild-controlled supply chains. The presence of a distinctive pink mortar in buildings across a wide region, but nowhere else, suggests a recipe that was a closely guarded secret of a specific mobile brotherhood. Historians note that sometimes the most telling clue is not what is present, but what is absent. The sudden, uniform adoption of a new architectural style across multiple cities in a short period, like the rapid spread of the Gothic rib vault, signals not a public sharing of ideas, but the movement of a tight-knit, expert workforce, a guild chapter on the march. The pace of construction itself is evidence. A cathedral that rises with remarkable speed and consistency over generations implies not just pious fervor, but a highly organized, continuously funded administrative machine, the kind only a powerful guild could sustain. This painstaking detective work reveals a profound irony. The measures the guilds took to render their knowledge invisible, the oaths, the secret symbols, the controlled apprenticeships forced them to create elaborate external structures of finance, law, and logistics. Those structures, designed to protect the mystery, became its unwitting chroniclers. Every contract, every lawsuit, every payroll entry was a tiny crack in the veil. By patiently assembling these fragments, scholars perform their own act of unlocking, proving that no human system, no matter how secretive or powerful, can completely erase the story of how it operated. The past guards its secrets, but it always leaves a trail for those determined enough to follow. Our journey ends where it began, with a whisper in stone. We have walked through the guild halls and across the scaffolding of history, tracing how a brotherhood of survival transformed into a fortress of secrecy. From the first protective circles of masons to the royal charters that turned their knowledge into law, we witnessed a monopoly built layer by layer, controlling not just what was built, but who was allowed to learn how to build it. This system gave us the cathedrals that scrape the sky, marvels of engineering that stand as testaments to what concentrated, protected expertise can achieve. Yet for every soaring vault, there was a simpler bridge never constructed, a clever idea quietly suppressed, a mind left outside the gates. Their legacy is indeed a double-edged sword. We inherited from them the very architecture of our professions, the idea of certified mastery and ethical codes that build trust in complex skills. But we also inherited their cautionary tale, a vivid demonstration of how the instinct to protect valuable knowledge can, over time, curdle into a resistance to change that benefits the few at the expense of the many. The true secret these guilds mastered was not merely a geometric formula or a recipe for stained glass. It was the timeless principle that knowledge, when carefully guarded and strategically controlled, becomes a form of power as tangible as any castle wall. That lesson, etched into the stones of our past, continues to echo in our present, challenging us to ask where we draw the line between protecting innovation and imprisoning it. If this exploration into the hidden mechanics of history has intrigued you, There are countless more stories waiting in the shadows. Consider subscribing to join future journeys into the past and share your perspective. Where do you see the modern echoes of these ancient knowledge monopolies in our world today? The conversation, much like the pursuit of understanding, is never truly finished.